Chapter 17. Dawn came, the dawn of a day that I am destined never to forget. Long rosy streamers of light broke through the forest, shaking, quivering, like unstable beams from celestial searchlights. Mist floated upward from marsh and lake, and through it the spectral palms loomed, drooping fronds embroidered with dew. For a while, the ringing outburst of bird music dominated all, but it soon ceased, with dropping notes from the crimson cardinals repeated in lengthening minor intervals. And then the spell of silence returned, broken only by the faint splash of mullet, mocking the sun with sinuous silver flashes. "Good morning," said a low voice from the door as I stood encouraging the campfire with splinterwood and dead palmetto fans. Fresh and sweet from her toilet as a dew-drenched rose, Miss Barrison stood there, sniffing the morning air daintily, thoroughly. "Too much perfume," she said. "Too much like ylang-ylang in a department store. Central Park smells sweeter on an April morning."
"Are you criticizing the wild jasmine?" I asked.
"I'm criticizing an exotic smell. Am I not permitted to comment on the tropics?" Fishing out a cedar log from the lumber sack, I fell to chopping it vigorously. The axe strokes made a cheerful racket through the woods.
"Did you hear anything last night after you retired?" I asked.
Something was at my window, something that thumped softly and seemed to be feeling all over the glass. To tell you the truth, I was silly enough to remain dressed all night.
"You don't look it," I said.
"Oh, when daylight came, I had a chance," she added, laughing.
"All the same," said I, leaning on the axe and watching her, "you are about the coolest and pluckiest woman I ever knew."
"We were all in the same fix," she said modestly.
"No, we were not. Now I'll tell you the truth. My hair stood up the greater part of the night. You are looking upon a poltroon, Miss Barrison."
"Then there was something at your window, too."
"Something? A dozen! They were monkeying with the sashes and panes all night long, and I imagined that I could hear them breathing, as though from effort of intense eagerness. Ouch! I came as near losing my nerve as I care to. I came within an ace of hurling those cursed pies through the window at them. I'd bolt today if I wasn't afraid to play the coward."
"Most people are brave for that reason," she said.
The dog, who had slept under my bunk and who had contributed to my entertainment by sighing and moaning all night, now appeared ready for business. Business, in his case, being the operation of feeding. I presented him with a concentrated tablet, which he cautiously investigated and then rolled on. "Nice testimonial for the people who concocted it," I said in disgust. "I wish I had an egg."
"There are some concentrated egg tablets in the shanty," said Miss Barrison, but the idea was not attractive.
"I refuse to fry a pill for breakfast," I said sullenly, and set the coffee pot on the coals. In spite of the dewy beauty of the morning, breakfast was not a cheerful function. Professor Farrago appeared, clad in sun helmet and khaki. I had seldom seen him depressed, but he was now, and his very efforts to disguise it only emphasized his visible anxiety. His preparations for the day, too, had an ominous aspect to me. He gave his orders, and we obeyed, instinctively suppressing questions. First, he and I transported all personal luggage of the company to the big electric launch, Miss Barrison's effects, his and my own. His private papers, the stenographic reports, and all memoranda were tied up together and carried aboard. Then, to my surprise, 2 weeks' concentrated rations for 2, and mineral water sufficient for the same period, were stowed away aboard the launch. Several times he asked me whether I knew how to run the boat, and I assured him that I did. In a short time, nothing was left ashore except the bare furnishings of the cabin, the female-wearing apparel, the steel cage and chemicals which I had brought, and the 12 apple pies, the latter under lock and key in my room.
As the preparations came to an end, the professor's gentle melancholy seemed to deepen. Once I ventured to ask him if he was indisposed, and he replied that he had never felt in better physical condition. Presently he made me fetch the pies, and I brought them, and, at a sign from him, placed them inside the steel cage, closing and locking the door. "I believe," he said, glancing from Miss Barrison to me, and from me to the dog, "I believe that we are ready to start." He went to the cabin and locked the door on the outside, pocketing the key. Then he backed up to the steel cage, stooped and lifted his end as I lifted mine, and together we started off through the forest, bearing the cage between us as porters carry a heavy piece of luggage. Miss Barrison came next, carrying the trousseau, the tank, hose, and chemicals, and the dog followed her, probably not from affection for us, but because he was afraid to be left alone. We walked in silence, the professor and I keeping an instinctive lookout for snakes, but we encountered nothing of that sort. On every side, touching our shoulders, crowded the closely woven and impenetrable tangle of the jungle, and we threaded it along a narrow path which he, no doubt, had cut, for the machete marks were still fresh, and the blazes on hickory, live oak, and palm were all wet with dripping sap and swarming with eager, brilliant butterflies. At times, across our course, flowed shallow, rapid streams of water, clear as crystal and most alluring to the thirsty. "There's fever in every drop," said the professor, as I mentioned my thirst. "Take the bottled water if you mean to stay a little longer." "Stay where?" I asked. "On Earth," he replied tersely, and we marched on. The beauty of the tropics is marred somewhat for me. Under all the fresh splendor of color, death lurks in brilliant tints. Where painted fruit hangs temptingly, where great silky blossoms exhale alluring scent, where the elaps coils, inlaid with scarlet, black, and saffron, where in the shadow of a palmetto frond a succession of velvety black diamonds mark the rattler's swollen length, there is death. And his invisible consort, horror, creeps where the snake whose mouth is lined with white creeps, where the tarantula squats, hairy, motionless, where a bit of living enamel, fringed with orange, undulates along a mossy log. Thinking of these things, and watchful lest, unawares, terror unfold from some blossoming and leafy covert, I scarcely noticed the beauty of the glade we had entered. A long oval, cross-barred with sunshine, which fell on hedges of scrub palmetto, chin-high, interlaced with golden blossoms of the jasmine, and all around, like pillars, supporting a high green canopy above a throne, towered the silvery stems of palms, fretted with pale, rose-tinted lichens, and hung with draperies of grapevine. "This is the place," said Professor Farrago. His quiet, passionless voice sounded strange to me. His words seemed strange too, each one heavily weighted with hidden meaning. We set the cage on the ground. He unlocked and opened the steel-barred door, and, kneeling, carefully arranged the pies along the center of the cage. "I have a curious presentiment," he said, "that I shall not come out of this experiment unscathed." "Don't, for heaven's sake, say that!" I broke out, my nerves on edge again. "Why not?" he asked, surprised. "I am not afraid." "Not afraid to die?" I demanded, exasperated. "Who spoke of dying?" he inquired mildly. "What I said was that I do not expect to come out of this affair unscathed." I did not comprehend his meaning, but I understood the reproof conveyed. He closed and locked the cage door again and came towards us, balancing the key across the palm of his hand. Miss Barrison had seated herself on the leaves. I stood back as the professor sat down beside her. Then, at a gesture from him, took the place he indicated on his left. "Before we begin," he said calmly, "there are several things you ought to know and which I have not yet told you. The first concerns the feminine wearing apparel which Mr. Gilland brought me."
He turned to Miss Barrison and asked her whether she had brought a complete outfit, and she opened the bundle on her knees and handed it to him. "I cannot," he said, "delicately explain in so many words what use I expect to make of this apparel, nor do I yet know whether I shall have any use at all for it. That can only be a theoretical speculation until, within a few more hours, my theory is proven or disproven. And," he said, suddenly turning on me, "my theory concerning these invisible creatures is the most extraordinary and audacious theory ever entertained by man since Columbus presumed that there must lie somewhere a hidden continent which nobody had ever seen." He passed his hand over his protruding forehead, lost for a moment in deepest reflection. Then, "Have you ever heard of the Spyhx?" he asked. "It seems to me that Ponce de Leon wrote of something," I began, hesitating. "Yes, the famous lines in the 3rd volume which have set so many wise men guessing. You recall them. And there, alas, within the sound of the fountain of youth, whose waters tint the skin till the whole body glows softly like the petal of a rose, there, alas, in the new world already blooming, the eternal enigma I beheld, in the flesh living, yet it faded even as I looked, although I swear it lived and breathed. This is the Spyhx." A silence. Then I said, "Those lines are meaningless to me." "Not to me," said Miss Barrison softly. The professor looked at her. "Ah, child, ever subtler, ever surer. The eternal enigma is no enigma to you." "What is the Spyhx?" I asked. "Have you read De Soto or Goya?" "Yes, both. I remember now that De Soto records the Spyhx legend of the Sphinx, something about a goddess." "Not a goddess," said Miss Barrison, her lips touched with a smile. "Sometimes," said the professor gently. "And Goya said, 'It has come to my ears while in the lands of the Spyhx that the Sphinx surely lives, as bolder and more curious men than I may, God willing, prove to the world hereafter.'" "But what is the Sphinx?" I insisted. "For centuries, wise men and savants have asked each other that question. I have answered it for myself. I am now to prove it, I trust." His face darkened, and again he stroked his heavy brow. "If anything occurs," he said, taking my hand in his left and Miss Barrison's hand in his right, "promise me to obey my wishes, will you?" "Yes," we said together. "If I lose my life, or disappear, promise me, on your honor, you'll get to the electric launch as soon as possible and make all speed northward, placing my private papers, the reports of Miss Barrison, and your own reports in the hands of the authorities in Bronx Park. Don't attempt to aid me. Don't delay to search for me. Do you promise?" "Yes," we breathed together. He looked at us solemnly. "If you fail me, you betray me," he said. We swore obedience. "Then let us begin," he said, and he rose and went to the steel cage. Unlocking the door, he flung it wide and stepped inside, leaving the cage door open. "The moment a single pie is disturbed," he said to me, "I shall close the steel door from the inside, and you and Miss Barrison will then dump the rhosium oxide and the strontium into the tank, clap on the lid, turn the nozzle of the hose on the cage, and spray it thoroughly. Whatever is invisible in the cage will become visible and of a faint rose color. And when the trapped creature becomes visible, hold yourselves ready to aid me, as long as I am able to give you orders. After that, either all will go well, or all will go otherwise, and you must run for the launch." He seated himself in the cage near the open door. I placed the steel tank near the cage, uncoiled the hose attachment, unscrewed the top, and dumped in the salts of strontium. Miss Barrison unwrapped the bottle of rhosium oxide and loosened the cork. We examined this pearl and pink powder and shook it up so that it might run out quickly. Then Miss Barrison sat down, and presently became absorbed in a stenographic report of the proceedings up to date. When Miss Barrison finished her report, she handed me the bundle of papers. I stowed them away in my wallet, and we sat down together beside the tank. Inside the cage, Professor Farrago was seated, his spectacled eyes fixed on the row of pies. For a while, although realizing perfectly that our quarry was transparent and invisible, we unconsciously strained our eyes in quest of something stirring in the forest. "I should think," said I in a low voice, "that the odor of the pies might draw at least one out of the odd dozen that came rubbing up against my window last night." "Hush! Listen!" she breathed, but we heard nothing save the snoring of the overfed dog at our feet. "He'll give us ample notice by butting into Miss Barrison's skirts," I observed. "No need of our watching, Professor." The professor nodded. Presently he removed his spectacles and lay back against the bars, closing his eyes. At first the forest silence seemed cheerful there in the flecked sunlight. The spotted wood gnats gyrated merrily, chased by dragonflies. The shy woodbirds hopped from branch to twig, peering at us in friendly inquiry. A lithe gray squirrel, plumy tail undulating, rambled serenely about the cage, sniffing at the pastry within. Suddenly, without apparent reason, the squirrel sprang to a tree trunk, hung a moment on the bark, quivering all over, then dashed away into the jungle. "Why did he act like that?" whispered Miss Barrison, and, after a moment, "How still it is! Where have all the birds gone?" In the ominous silence, the dog began to whimper in his sleep, and his hind leg kicked convulsively. "He's dreaming," I began. The words were almost driven down my throat by the dog, who, without a yelp of warning, hurled himself at Miss Barrison and alighted on my chest, forepaws around my neck. I cast him scornfully from me, but he scrambled back, digging like a mole to get under us. "The transparent creatures," whispered Miss Barrison. "Look, see that pie move." I sprang to my feet, just as the professor, jamming on his spectacles, leaned forward and slammed the cage door. "I've got one!" he shouted frantically. "There's one in the cage! Turn on that hose!" "Wait a second," said Miss Barrison, calmly, uncorking the bottle and pouring a pearly stream of rhosium oxide into the tank. "Quick, it's fizzing. Screw on the top." In a second I had screwed the top fast, seized the hose, and directed a hissing cloud of vapor through the cage bars. For a moment nothing was heard save the whistling rush of the perfumed spray escaping. A delicious odor of roses filled the air. Then, slowly, there in the sunshine, a misty something grew in the cage, a glistening, pearl-tinted phantom, imperceptibly taking shape in space. Vague at first as a shred of lake vapor, then lengthening, rounding into flowing form, clearer, clearer. "The Spyhx!" gasped the professor. "In the name of heaven, play that hose!" As he spoke, the treacherous hose burst. A showery pillar of rose-colored vapor enveloped everything. Through the thickening fog, for one brief instant, a human form appeared like magic. A woman's form, flawless, exquisite as a statue, pure as marble. Then the swimming vapor buried it, cage, pies, and all. We ran frantically around, the cage in the obscurity, appealing for instructions and feeling for the bars. Once the professor's muffled voice was heard demanding the wearing apparel, and I groped about and found it, and stuffed it through the bars of the cage. "Do you need help?" I shouted. There was no response. Staring around through the thickening vapor of rhosium, rolling in clouds from the overturned tank, I heard Miss Barrison's voice calling. "I can't move. A transparent lady is holding me." Blindly I rushed about, arms outstretched, and the next moment struck the door of the cage so hard that the impact almost knocked me senseless. Clutching it to steady myself, it suddenly flew open. A rush of partly visible creatures passed me like a burst of pink flames, and in the midst, borne swiftly away on the crest of the outrush, the professor passed like a bolt shot from a catapult.
and his last cry wafted back to me from the forest as I swayed there, drunk with the stupefying perfume. "Don't worry, I'm all right." I staggered out into the clearer air towards a figure seen dimly through swirling vapor. "Are you hurt?" I stammered, clasping Miss Barrison in my arms. "No, oh no," she said, wringing her hands. "But the professor, I saw him. I could not scream. I could not move. They had him." "I saw him too," I groaned. There was not one trace of terror on his face. He was actually smiling. Overcome at the sublime courage of the man, we wept in each other's arms. True to our promise to Professor Farrago, we made the best of our way northward, and it was not a difficult journey by any means, the voyage in the launch across Okeechobee being perfectly simple, and the trail to the nearest railroad station but a few easy miles from the landing place. Shocking as had been our experience, dreadful as was the calamity which had not only robbed me of a lifelong friend, but had also bereaved the entire scientific world, I could not seem to feel that desperate and hopeless grief which the natural decease of a close friend might warrant. No, there remained a vague expectancy which so dominated my sorrow that at moments I became hopeful, nay, sanguine, that I should one day again behold my beloved superior in the flesh. There was something so happy in his last smile, something so artlessly pleased, that I was certain no fear of impending dissolution worried him as he disappeared into the uncharted depth of the unknown Everglades. I think Miss Barrison agreed with me too. She appeared to be more or less dazed, which was, of course, quite natural, and during our return voyage across Okeechobee and through the lagoons and forests beyond, she was very silent. When we reached the railroad at Portulaca, a thrifty lemon-growing ranch on the Volusia and Chinkapin Railway, the first thing I did was to present my dog to the station agent. But I was obliged to give him $5 before he consented to accept the dog. However, Miss Barrison interviewed the station master's wife, a kindly, pitiful soul who promised to be a good mistress to the creature. We both felt better after that was off our minds. We felt better still when the northbound train rolled leisurely into the white glare of Portulaca, and presently rolled out again, quite as leisurely, bound, thank heaven, for that abused aggregation of sinful boroughs called New York. Except for one young man whom I encountered in the smoker, we had the train to ourselves, a circumstance which, curiously enough, appeared to increase Miss Barrison's depression, and my own as a natural sequence. The circumstances of the taking off of Professor Farrago appeared to engross her thoughts so completely that it made me uneasy during our trip out from Little Sprite. In fact, it was growing plainer to me every hour that in her brief acquaintance with that distinguished scientist, she had become personally attached to him to an extent that began to worry me. Her personal indignation at a caged Spyhx flared out at unexpected intervals, and there could be no doubt that her unhappiness and resentment were becoming morbid. I spent an hour or two in the smoking compartment, tenanted only by a single passenger and myself. He was an agreeable young man, although in the natural acquaintanceship that we struck up, I regretted to learn that he was a writer of popular fiction, returning from Fort Worth, where he had been for the sole purpose of composing a poem on Florida. I have always, in common with other mentally balanced savants, despised writers of fiction. All scientists harbor a natural antipathy to romance in any form, and that antipathy becomes a deep horror if fiction dares to deal flippantly with the exact sciences, or if some degraded intellect assumes the warrantless liberty of using natural history as a vehicle for silly tales. Never but once had I been tempted to romance in any form. Never but once had sentiment interfered with the passionless transfer of scientific notes to the sanctuary of the unvarnished notebook, or the cloister of the juiceless monograph. Nor have I the slightest approach to that superficial and doubtful quality known as literary skill. Once, however, as I sat alone in the middle of the floor, classifying my isopods, I was not only astonished, but totally unprepared to find myself repeating aloud a verse that I myself had unconsciously fashioned. An isopod is a work of God. Never before in all my life had I made a rhyme, and it worried me for weeks, ringing in my brain day and night, confusing me, interfering with my thoughts. I said as much to the young man, who only laughed good-naturedly and replied that it was the Creator's purpose to limit certain intellects, nobody knows why, and that it was apparent that mine had not escaped. "There's one thing, however," he said, "that might be of some interest to you, and come within the circumscribed scope of your intelligence." "And what is that?" I asked tartly. "A scientific experience of mine," he said, with a careless laugh. "It's so much stranger than fiction that even Professor Bruce Stoddard of Columbia hesitated to credit it." I looked at the young fellow suspiciously. His bland smile disarmed me, but I did not invite him to relate his experience, although he apparently needed only that encouragement to begin. "Now, if I could tell it exactly as it occurred," he observed, "and a stenographer could take it down, word for word, exactly as I relate it." "It would give me great pleasure to do so," said a quiet voice at the door. We rose at once, removing the cigars from our lips, but Miss Barrison bade us continue smoking, and at a gesture from her, we resumed our seats after she had installed herself by the window. "Really," she said, looking at me coldly, "I couldn't endure the solitude any longer. Isn't there anything to do on this tiresome train?" "If you had your pad and pencil," I began maliciously, "you might take down a matter of interest." She looked frankly at the young man, who laughed in that pleasant, good-tempered manner of his, and offered to tell us of his alleged scientific experience, if we thought it might amuse us sufficiently to vary the dull monotony of the journey north. "Is it fiction?" I asked, point blank. "It is absolute truth," he replied. I rose and went off to find pad and pencil. When I returned, Miss Barrison was laughing at a story which the young man had just finished. "But," he ended gravely, "I have practically decided to renounce fiction as a means of livelihood, and confine myself to simple, uninteresting statistics and facts." "I am very glad to hear you say that," I exclaimed warmly. He bowed, looked at Miss Barrison, and asked her when he might begin his story. "Whenever you are ready," replied Miss Barrison, smiling in a manner which I had not observed since the disappearance of Professor Farrago. I'll admit that the young man was superficially attractive. "Well then," he began modestly, "having no technical ability concerning the affair in question, and having no knowledge of either comparative anatomy or zoology, I am perhaps unfitted to tell this story. But the story is true. The episode occurred under my own eyes, within a few hours' sail of the Battery, and I was one of the first persons to verify what has long been a theory among scientists, and, moreover, as the result of Professor Holroyd's discovery is to be placed on exhibition in Madison Square Garden on the 20th of next month, I have decided to tell you, as simply as I am able, exactly what occurred. I first told the story on April 1st, 1903, to the editors of the North American Review, the Popular Science Monthly, the Scientific American, Nature, Outing, and the Fossiliferous Magazine. All these gentlemen rejected it, some curtly informing me that fiction had no place in their columns. When I attempted to explain that it was not fiction, the editors of these periodicals either maintained a contemptuous silence or bluntly notified me that my literary services and opinions were not desired. But finally, when several publishers offered to take the story as fiction, I cut short all negotiations and decided to publish it myself. Where I am known at all, it is my misfortune to be known as a writer of fiction. This makes it impossible for me to receive a hearing from a scientific audience. I regret it bitterly, because now, when it is too late, I am prepared to prove certain scientific matters of interest, and to produce the proofs. In this case, however, I am fortunate, for nobody can dispute the existence of a thing when the bodily proof is exhibited as evidence. This is the story, and if I tell it as I write fiction, it is because I do not know how to tell it otherwise. I was walking along the beach below Pine Inlet, on the south shore of Long Island. The railroad and telegraph station is at West Oyster Bay. Everybody who has traveled on the Long Island Railroad knows that station, but few, perhaps, know Pine Inlet. Duck shooters, of course, are familiar with it, but as there are no hotels there, and nothing to see except Salt Meadow, Salt Creek, and a strip of dune and sand, the summer squatting public may probably be unaware of its existence. The local name for the place is Pine Inlet. The maps give its name as Sand Point, I believe, but anybody at West Oyster Bay can direct you to it. Captain McPeak, who keeps the West Oyster Bay house, drives duck shooters there in winter. It lies 5 miles southeast from West Oyster Bay. I had walked over that afternoon from Captain McPeak's. There was a reason for my going to Pine Inlet. It embarrasses me to explain it, but the truth is, I meditated writing an ode to the ocean. It was out of the question to write it in West Oyster Bay, with the whistle of locomotives in my ears. I knew that Pine Inlet was one of the loneliest places on the Atlantic coast. It is out of sight of everything except leagues of gray ocean. Rarely one might make out fishing smacks drifting across the horizon. Summer squatters never visited it. Sportsmen shunned it, except in winter. Therefore, as I was about to do a bit of poetry, I thought that Pine Inlet was the spot for the deed, so I went there. As I was strolling along the beach, biting my pencil reflectively, tremendously impressed by the solitude and the solemn thunder of the surf, a thought occurred to me. How unpleasant it would be if I suddenly stumbled on a summer boarder. As this joyless impossibility flitted across my mind, I rounded a bleak sand dune. A girl stood directly in my path. She stared at me as though I had just crawled up out of the sea to bite her. I don't know what my own expression resembled, but I have been given to understand it was idiotic. Now I perceived, after a few moments, that the young lady was frightened, and I knew I ought to say something civil, so I said, "Are there many mosquitoes here?" "No," she replied, with a slight quiver in her voice. "I have only seen one, and it was biting somebody else." The conversation seemed so futile, and the young lady appeared to be more nervous than before. I had an impulse to say, "Do not run, I have breakfasted," for she seemed to be meditating a flight into the breakers. What I did say was, "I did not know anybody was here. I do not intend to intrude. I come from Captain McPeak's, and I am writing an ode to the ocean." After I had said this, it seemed to ring in my ears like, "I come from Table Mountain, and my name is Truthful James." I glanced timidly at her. "She's thinking of the same thing," said I to myself. However, the young lady seemed to be a trifle reassured. I noticed she drew a sigh of relief and looked at my shoes. She looked so long that it made me suspicious, and I also examined my shoes. They seemed to be in a fair state of repair. I am sorry," she said, "but would you mind not walking on the beach?" This was sudden. I had intended to retire and leave the beach to her, but I did not fancy being driven away so abruptly. "Dear me," she cried, "you don't understand. I would not think for a moment of asking you to leave Pine Inlet. I merely ventured to request you to walk on the dunes. I'm so afraid that your footprints may obliterate the impressions that my father is studying." "Oh," said I, looking about me as though I had been caught in the middle of a flower bed. "Really, I did not notice any impressions. Impressions of what?" "I don't know," she said, smiling a little at my awkward pose. "If you step this way in a straight line, you can do no damage." I did as she bade me. I suppose my movements resembled the gait of a wet peacock. Possibly they recalled the delicate maneuvers of the kangaroo. Anyway, she laughed. This seriously annoyed me.
I had been at a disadvantage. I walk well enough when let alone. You can scarcely expect, said I, that a man absorbed in his own ideas could notice impressions on the sand. I trust I have obliterated nothing. As I said this, I looked back at the long line of footprints stretching away in perspective across the sand. They were my own. How large they looked. Was that what she was laughing at? I wish to explain, she said gravely, looking at the point of her parasol. I am very sorry to be obliged to warn you, to ask you to forego the pleasure of strolling on a beach that does not belong to me. Perhaps, she continued in sudden alarm, perhaps this beach belongs to you. The beach? Oh no, I said. But you were going to write poems about it. Only one, and that does not necessitate owning the beach. I have observed, said I frankly, that the people who own nothing write many poems about it. She looked at me seriously. I write many poems, I added. She laughed doubtfully. Would you rather I went away? I asked politely. My family is respectable, I added, and I told her my name. Oh, then you wrote Called Cowslips and Faded Fig Leaves, and you imitate Maeterlinck, and you— Oh, I know lots of people that you know, she cried, with every symptom of relief, and you know my brother. I am the author, said I, coldly, of Called Cowslips, but Faded Fig Leaves was an earlier work, which I no longer recognize, and I should be grateful to you if you would be kind enough to deny that I ever imitated Maeterlinck. Possibly, I added, he imitates me. She was very quiet, and I saw she was sorry. Never mind, I said magnanimously. You probably are not familiar with modern literature. If I knew your name, I should ask permission to present myself. Why, I am Daisy Holroyd, she said. What? Jack Holroyd's little sister? Little, she cried. I didn't mean that, said I. You know that your brother and I were great friends in Paris. I know, she said significantly. Of course, I said. Jack and I were inseparable. Except when shut in separate cells, said Miss Holroyd coldly. This unfeeling allusion to the unfortunate termination of a Latin Quarter celebration hurt me. The police, I said, were too officious. So Jack says, replied Miss Holroyd demurely. We had unconsciously moved on along the sandhills side by side as we spoke. To think, I repeated, that I should meet Jack's little— Please, she said, you are only 3 years my senior. She opened the sunshade and tipped it over one shoulder. It was white and had spots and posies on it. Jack sends us every new book you write, she observed. I do not approve of some things you write. Modern school, I mumbled. That is no excuse, she said severely. Anthony Trollope didn't do it. The foam spume from the breakers was drifting across the dunes, and the little tip-up snipe ran along the beach and teetered and whistled and spread their white-barred wings for a low, straight flight across the shingle, only to tip and run and sail on again. The salt sea wind whistled and curled through the crested waves, blowing in perfumed puffs across thickets of sweet bay and cedar. As we passed through the crackling, juicy-stemmed marshweed, myriads of fiddler crabs raised their foreclaws in warning and backed away, rustling through the reeds aggressively, protesting. Like millions of pygmy ajaxes defying the lightning, I said. Miss Holroyd laughed. Now I never imagined that authors were clever except in print, she said. She was a most extraordinary girl. I suppose, she observed, after a moment's silence, I suppose I am taking you to my father. Delighted, I mumbled. I had the honor of meeting Professor Holroyd in Paris. Yes, he bailed you and Jack out, said Miss Holroyd serenely. The silence was too painful to last. Captain McPeak is an interesting man, I said. I spoke more loudly than I intended. I may have been nervous. Yes, said Daisy Holroyd, but he has a most singular hotel clerk. You mean Mr. Frisbee? I do. Yes, I admitted, Mr. Frisbee is queer. He was once a bill poster. I know it, exclaimed Daisy Holroyd, with some heat. He ruins landscapes whenever he has an opportunity. Do you know that he has a passion for bill posting? He has. He posts bills for the pure pleasure of it.
just as you play golf or tennis or squash." "But he's a hotel clerk now," I said. "Nobody employs him to post bills." "I know it. He does it all by himself for the pure pleasure of it. Papa has engaged him to come down here for 2 weeks, and I dread it," said the girl. What Professor Holroyd might want of Frisbee I had not the faintest notion. I suppose Miss Holroyd noticed the bewilderment in my face, for she laughed and nodded her head twice. "Not only Mr. Frisbee, but Captain McPeak also," she said. "You don't mean to say that Captain McPeak is going to close his hotel?" I exclaimed. "My trunk was there. It contained guarantees of my respectability." "Oh, no, his wife will keep it open," replied the girl. "Look, you can see Papa now. He's digging." "Where?" I blurted out. I remembered Professor Holroyd as a prim, spectacled gentleman, with close-cut, snowy beard and a clerical allure. The man I saw digging wore green goggles, a jersey, a battered sou'wester, and hip boots of rubber. He was delving in the muck of the salt meadow, his face streaming with perspiration, his boots and jersey splashed with unpleasant-looking mud. He glanced up as we approached, shading his eyes with a sunburned hand. "Papa dear," said Miss Holroyd, "here is Jack's friend, whom you bailed out of Mazas." The introduction was startling. I turned crimson with mortification. The professor was very decent about it. He called me by name at once. Then he looked at his spade. It was clear he considered me a nuisance and wished to go on with his digging. "I suppose," he said, "you are still writing." "A little," I replied, trying not to speak sarcastically. My output had rivaled that of the Duchess, in quantity, I mean. "I seldom read fiction," he said, looking restlessly at the hole in the ground. Miss Holroyd came to my rescue. "That was a charming story you wrote last," she said. "Papa should read it. You really should, Papa. It's all about a fossil." We both looked narrowly at Miss Holroyd. Her smile was guileless. "Fossils," repeated the professor. "Do you care for fossils?" "Very much," said I. Now, I am not perfectly sure what my object was in lying. I looked at Daisy Holroyd's dark-fringed eyes. They were very grave. "Fossils," said I, "are my hobby." I think Miss Holroyd winced a little at this. I did not care. I went on. "I have seldom had the opportunity to study the subject, but as a boy I collected flint arrowheads." "Flint arrowheads," said the professor coldly. "Yes, they were the nearest thing to fossils obtainable," I replied, marveling at my own mendacity. The professor looked into the hole. I also looked. I could see nothing in it. "He's digging for fossils," thought I to myself. "Perhaps," said the professor cautiously, "you might wish to aid me in a little research. That is to say, if you have an inclination for fossils." The double entendre was not lost upon me. "I have read all your books so eagerly," said I, "that to join you, to be of service to you in any research, however difficult and trying, would be an honor and a privilege that I never dared to hope for. That," thought I to myself, "will do its own work." But the professor was still suspicious. How could he help it when he remembered Jack's escapades, in which my name was always blended? Doubtless he was satisfied that my influence on Jack was evil. The contrary was the case too. "Fossils," he said, worrying the edge of the excavation with a spade. "Fossils are not things to be lightly considered." "No, indeed," I protested. "Fossils are the most interesting as well as puzzling things in the world," said he. "They are!" I cried enthusiastically. "But I am not looking for fossils," observed the professor mildly. This was a facer. I looked at Daisy Holroyd. She bit her lip and fixed her eyes on the sea. Her eyes were wonderful eyes. "Did you think I was digging for fossils in a salt meadow?" queried the professor. "You can have read very little about the subject. I am digging for something quite different." I was silent. I knew that my face was flushed. I longed to say, "Well, what the devil are you digging for?" but I only stared into the hole as though hypnotized. "Captain McPeak and Frisbee ought to be here," he said, looking first at Daisy and then across the meadows. I ached to ask him why he had subpoenaed Captain McPeak and Frisbee. "They are coming," said Daisy, shading her eyes. "Do you see the speck on the meadows?" "It may be a mud hen," said the Professor. "Miss Holroyd is right," I said. "A wagon and team and 2 men are coming from the north. There's a dog beside the wagon. It's that miserable yellow dog of Frisbee's." "Good gracious!" cried the Professor. "You don't mean to tell me that you can see all that at such a distance?" "Why not?" I said. "I see nothing," he insisted. "You will see that I am right presently," I laughed. The Professor removed his blue goggles and rubbed them, glancing obliquely at me. "Haven't you heard what extraordinary eyesight duck shooters have?" said his daughter, looking back at her father. "Jack says that he can tell exactly what kind of a duck is flying before most people could see anything at all in the sky." "It's true," I said. "It comes to anybody, I fancy, who has had practice." The Professor regarded me with a new interest. There was inspiration in his eyes. He turned towards the ocean. For a long time he stared at the tossing waves on the beach, and then he looked far out to where the horizon met the sea. "Are there any ducks out there?" he asked at last. "Yes," said I, scanning the sea, "there are." He produced a pair of binoculars from his coat-tail pocket, adjusted them, and raised them to his eyes. What sorts of ducks?" I looked more carefully, holding both hands over my forehead. "Surf ducks and widgeon. There is 1 bufflehead among them. No, 2. The rest are coots," I replied. "This," cried the Professor, "is most astonishing. I have good eyes, but I can't see a blessed thing without these binoculars." "It's not extraordinary," said I. "The surf ducks and coots any novice might recognize. The widgeon and buffleheads I should not have been able to name unless they had risen from the water. It is easy to tell any duck when it is flying, even though it looks no bigger than a black pinpoint." But the Professor insisted that it was marvelous, and he said that I might render him invaluable service if I would consent to come and camp at Pine Inlet for a few weeks. I looked at his daughter, but she turned her back. Her back was beautifully molded. Her gown fitted also. "Camp out here?" I repeated, pretending to be unpleasantly surprised. "I do not think you would care to," said Miss Holroyd, without turning. I had not expected that. "Above all things," said I, in a clear, pleasant voice, "I like to camp out." She said nothing. "It is not exactly camping," said the Professor. "Come, you shall see our conservatory. Daisy, dear, you must put on a heavier frock. It is getting towards sundown." At that moment, over a near dune, 2 horses' heads appeared, followed by 2 human heads, then a wagon, then a yellow dog. I turned triumphantly to the Professor. "You are the very man I want," he muttered. "The very man. The very man." I looked at Daisy Holroyd. She returned my glance with a defiant little smile. "Wall," said Captain McPeak, driving up, "here we be. Get out, Frisbee." Frisbee, fat, nervous, and sentimental, hopped out of the cart. "Come," said the Professor, impatiently moving across the dunes. I walked with Daisy Holroyd. McPeak and Frisbee followed. The yellow dog walked by himself.